Imagine being 22 weeks pregnant, standing in the nursery you just painted for your miracle baby, while your husband of 6 years packs his bags and demands a prenatal DNA test. Why? Because of a single, anonymous email in the blink of an eye. He drains their joint bank account of $50,000. He cancels her health insurance. He leaves her to face a brutal winter storm and a premature birth completely alone. He thought he was punishing her. He wanted to break her. But what happens when the DNA test finally comes back with a 99.9% match? And the IP address of that anonymous, life-destroying email points directly to his own mother's house. This is a story of ultimate betrayal, a devastatingly toxic mother-in-law, and the terrifyingly beautiful power of a woman who refuses to be shattered. Sometimes, the greatest betrayal is actually the universe handing you the keys to your absolute freedom. If you believe in the undeniable strength of starting over and the power of a mother's love, hit that like button. Share your own thoughts in the comments. And subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption.
Swoosh, swoosh. The sound of the wet paint roller filled the small room. Clara stepped back and wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. She smiled at the pale yellow wall. The color was bright and cheerful. It looked like pure sunshine. You missed a spot right by the baseboard, Harrison said. He stood in the doorway. He was holding a wet rag. He wore an old gray t-shirt covered in white dust. His dark hair was messy. He looked happy. I did not miss it, Clara said. I am saving the edges for the small brush. Harrison walked into the room. His work boots left faint footprints on the plastic drop cloth. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder. The room looks incredible, he said. You did a great job. Clara, we did a great job, Clara replied. She leaned back against his chest. He moved one hand to rest on her rounded stomach. She was exactly 22 weeks pregnant. Her belly was perfectly firm under her oversized shirt. The baby shifted slightly. Harrison let out a soft laugh. She is kicking again, he said. She loves the smell of fresh paint. Clara said. The sharp smell of the latex paint was strong but clean. It smelled like new beginnings. Clara closed her eyes. She let herself feel the perfect warmth of the moment. The afternoon sun poured through the bare window. It warmed her skin, for this was her brilliant summer. Everything was exactly as it should be. She was 36 years old. She and Harrison had been married for 6 years. They had spent 3 of those years trying to have a child. There had been so many negative tests. There had been so many silent tears in the bathroom. They had almost given up hope completely. Then came this wonderful, unexpected pregnancy. It felt like a miracle. A baby on the way changed everything in their house. The quiet rooms were suddenly filled with plans and laughter. I am going to get us some drinks, Harrison said. He kissed her cheek and stepped away. Do not paint the ceiling while I am gone. I make no promises, Clara said. She walked over to the open window. She took a deep breath of the warm spring air. The neighborhood was quiet. A lawnmower hummed in the far distance. I finally have everything I wanted. The waiting is over. Our family is complete. These thoughts were solid and real in her mind. She felt entirely safe. Harrison returned a minute later. He handed her a tall glass of lemonade. Ice cold, he said. Clara took the glass. The cold condensation wet her sticky fingers. The ice cubes clinked happily against the glass. The lemonade was perfectly tart and sweet. Thank you, she said. My beautiful pregnant wife. Harrison said softly. He smiled at her. The doorbell rang. The sharp, sudden chime shattered the quiet atmosphere. Ding-dong. Harrison sighed. I forgot. My mother said she might drop by today. Clara felt a tiny prickle of tension in her chest. She took another sip of her drink. The lemonade suddenly tasted a bit too sour. I will go let her in, Harrison said. He turned and walked down the hall. Clara set her glass down on the windowsill. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She tried to arrange her face into a welcoming smile. Margaret was not an easy woman to please. She was 62 years old and carried herself with stiff authority. Heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood stairs. Clara, are you up here? Margaret called out. In the nursery. Margaret, Clara answered. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She wore a crisp navy blazer and pearls. Her heavy floral perfume instantly overpowered the smell of the fresh paint. It was a suffocating scent of lavender and old roses. Oh, Margaret said. She looked around the room. She did not smile. Yellow. We wanted something gender neutral, Clara said, even though we know it is a girl. Yellow is very bright, Margaret said. She stepped carefully onto the plastic sheet. Her low heels clicked sharply against the floor underneath. It might overstimulate the infant. We like it, Harrison said. He came up behind his mother. It feels warm. Margaret hummed quietly. It was not a sound of agreement. It was a sound of judgment. She carried a small white gift bag. She held it out to Clara. I bought a few things, Margaret said. Just some practical items. You seem to be rushing into all this decorating. Thank you, Margaret, Clara said. She took the bag. The paper was stiff and expensive. Well, you are certainly showing early, Margaret said. Her eyes locked onto Clara's stomach. Her gaze was cold and calculating. Dr. Sullivan says I am measuring perfectly on schedule, Clara replied. She kept her voice polite and steady. Are you sure about the dates? Clara, Margaret asked. The question hung in the air. The room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. The warm sunlight seemed to vanish. What do you mean? Clara asked. The dates, Margaret repeated smoothly. I am just doing the math in my head. You traveled so much in October. You were in Chicago for that conference. Almost an entire week. Clara felt her stomach drop. The cold weight settled in her chest. I know when I conceived, Margaret, Clara said. Her voice was slightly tighter now. Mother is just curious, Harrison said. He laughed nervously. You know how she is with details. I am only looking out for the health of the child, Margaret said. She adjusted her pearl necklace. Sometimes ultrasound dates can be wrong, especially when the mother has a demanding travel schedule away from home. She put a heavy emphasis on the words, away from home. I am not crazy. I know exactly what she is implying. Clara looked at Harrison. She expected him to say something firm. She expected him to shut the conversation down. We trust the doctor, Harrison said weakly. He looked at the floor. He refused to meet Clara's eyes. Anyway, let us go downstairs. I can make some coffee. That sounds lovely, Harrison, Margaret said. She turned around. She did not look at Clara again. They walked down the hall together. Their voices faded as they descended the stairs. Clara stood alone in the yellow room. Her heart was beating too fast. She looked at the wet paint on the walls. The cheerful color suddenly looked sickly. She looked at her own hands. They were trembling slightly. Do not let her get into your head. She has always been like this. She is just jealous of our happiness. Clara picked up her wet roller. She dipped it back into the paint tray. She pressed it against the wall. She rolled it up and down. Swoosh, swoosh. She painted for another hour. She did not downstairs for coffee. When Harrison finally returned, the sun was beginning to set. The room was cast in long, gray shadows. She left, Harrison said. He stood in the doorway again. That was a very strange comment she made, Clara said. She did not turn around. She kept painting. What comment? Harrison asked. About my trip to Chicago. Clara said. Duh. About the dates. Harrison sighed loudly. Clara, please, do not overreact. You know how she is. How is she? Harrison, Clara asked. She stopped painting and turned to face him. She is just protective, he said. He crossed his arms over his chest. She wants everything to be perfect. Let us be rational about this. She did not mean anything by it. It sounded like she meant something very specific, Clara replied. Or just letting your pregnancy hormones get the best of you, Harrison said. He forced a smile. Come on, wash up. Let us order some dinner. He walked away before she could answer. Clara stared at the empty doorway. The silence in the house felt heavy. He never defends me. He always takes her side. She carefully cleaned her brushes in the bathroom sink. The water ran cloudy and yellow down the drain. She watched the color wash away until the water was perfectly clear. They ate pizza in the living room. The television played a comedy show. Neither of them laughed. Harrison seemed distracted. He kept his phone face down on the coffee table. He reached for it twice, but pulled his hand back both times. Are you expecting a call from work? Clara asked. No, Harrison answered quickly. Just tired. They went to bed early. The bedroom was dark and cool. The window was open a crack. The sound of crickets chirping filled the night air. Clara lay on her side. She faced the window. She kept her eyes closed. But she was not asleep. Her mind was racing. She felt the mattress shift. Harrison was moving behind her. She heard a soft click. She opened her eyes slightly. The room was no longer completely dark. A pale blue light cast a shadow on the wall in front of her. Harrison had unlocked his phone. Clara held her breath. She did not move a single muscle. She pretended to be deeply asleep. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. The blue light glowed steadily. Harrison was reading something long. Just. Clara carefully tilted her head just a fraction of an inch. She caught the reflection of his phone screen in the dark window glass. It was a text message thread. The sender's name was at the top, Margaret. There were paragraphs of text. Clara could not read the individual words in the reflection, but she could see the volume of the messages. Her mother-in-law had sent a massive wall of text. Harrison's thumbs began to move. He was typing a reply. Tap, tap, tap. The tiny sounds of his fingers hitting the glass screen seemed deafening in the quiet room. He typed for a long time. Then he hit send. The blue light vanished. The room plunged back into total darkness. Harrison shifted again. He rolled over onto his back. He let out a long, heavy sigh. It was not the sigh of a contented man. It was the sigh of a man carrying a secret weight. Clara lay perfectly still in the dark. The brilliant summer was over. The chill of the first autumn rain had entered her bedroom. I know something is wrong. I can feel it in the air. She placed her hand gently over her stomach in the darkness. The baby was completely still. Clara closed her eyes. She listened to the steady sound of Harrison breathing beside her. He was physically close, but he felt miles away. The distance between them was growing in the dark. She did not know what the messages said. She did not know what poison Margaret was pouring into his ear. But as she lay there in the silence, one truth became absolutely clear to her. The foundation of her perfect life was already beginning to crack. Tick, tick, tick. The large black wall clock in the waiting room was exceptionally loud. Clara sat on the edge of the stiff vinyl chair. She shifted her weight. The plastic cover crinkled sharply underneath her. The smell of medicinal alcohol and glossy magazine pages hung heavy in the air. She checked her phone screen for the fourth time. 2:15 in the afternoon. Her anatomy scan was scheduled for 2:30. Harrison was late. Clara watched the heavy glass door at the front of the clinic. Every time someone walked past, she expected to see his broad shoulders. She expected to see his familiar rush of energy, but the door remained closed. Her phone vibrated in her hand. A short text message appeared on the screen. Stuck at the office. Cannot leave. So sorry, get pictures. Clara stared at the glowing words. Her chest tightened. A dull ache settled behind her ribs. He promised he would be here. This is the most important appointment. She typed a reply. It is the 20-week scan. Harrison, we are supposed to see her face. The three little typing dots appeared on the screen. Then they vanished. He did not reply. Clara, a cheerful voice called out. Clara looked up. A young nurse in blue scrubs stood by the wooden door. She held a thick paper file. Dr. Sullivan is ready for you. The nurse said, My husband is running late. Clara replied, Can we give him 5 more minutes? I am sorry. The nurse said gently, We have a fully booked schedule today. We need to get started. Clara stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her maternity blouse. She felt a sudden, deep wave of embarrassment. The waiting room was full of other couples. They were holding hands. They were whispering happily to each other. Clara walked through the wooden door entirely alone. The examination room was dim and cold. The bright fluorescent lights had been turned off. A single warm lamp glowed in the corner. Dr. Sullivan entered the room a moment later. He was 55 years old. He had kind eyes and graying hair. He smiled warmly at Clara. Hello, Clara. Dr. Sullivan said, Where is the proud father today? Work emergency. Clara lied. The lie tasted like chalk in her mouth. He could not get away. That is a shame. Dr. Sullivan said, Well, let us take a look at this beautiful baby on the way. Clara lay back on the crinkling paper of the examination table. She pulled her shirt up. The doctor squeezed a large amount of clear gel onto her stomach. It was freezing cold. Clara gasped slightly at the sharp chill. The doctor pressed the plastic wand against her skin. He moved it around in slow circles. A fuzzy black and white image appeared on the monitor. Then came the sound. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It was the rapid, rhythmic beating of her daughter's heart. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. But as Clara listened to the strong rhythm, a hot tear slipped down her cheek. It rolled into her hairline. She was experiencing this perfect moment completely alone. Everything looks completely healthy. Dr. Sullivan said. He clicked a button on the machine. She has 10 fingers and 10 toes. Heart rate is perfectly normal. You are doing a wonderful job. Clara, thank you. Dr. Clara whispered. He printed out a long strip of glossy photos. He handed them to her with a gentle smile. Take these home to your husband, he said. Make sure he puts them on the refrigerator. Clara drove home in absolute silence. She did not turn on the radio. The gray afternoon sky matched her heavy mood. The first autumn rain was beginning to fall. Tiny drops hit the windshield with soft taps. She parked her car in the driveway. The large house looked dark and empty. Clara unlocked the front door. The lock clicked loudly in the silent hallway. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl on the table. The sharp clatter echoed against the high ceiling. She walked into the kitchen. The house was too quiet. The silence felt oppressive. Clara walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator. She grabbed the silver handle. She pulled the heavy door open. A blast of cold air hit her face. The bright interior light illuminated the glass shelves. She stared blindly at the carton of milk. She looked at the fresh vegetables in the bottom drawer. She did not need anything. Her mind was racing with strange, formless anxiety. Why did he cancel? He has never missed a doctor appointment before. She pushed the heavy door closed. It sealed with a soft thud. She stood there for a moment. Then, She reached out and pulled the door open again. The cold air rushed out. The light clicked on. She stared at the milk again. I am making excuses for him. He is avoiding me. She closed the door. 10 seconds passed. Her hand reached out. She opened the refrigerator door for a third time. She stared into the cold, brightly lit space. She felt entirely frozen. Her brain was spinning in endless, exhausting circles. Finally, she slammed the door shut. Tough. She walked into the living room and sat heavily on the velvet sofa. She placed the ultrasound photos on the glass coffee table. She waited. Harrison came home 2 hours later. The front door opened and closed. Heavy footsteps moved down the hall. Harrison walked into the living room. His tie was pulled loose. His suit jacket was draped over one arm. "Hello," Clara said quietly. Harrison jumped slightly. He had not noticed her sitting in the dim room. "You startled me," she said. He did not come over to kiss her. He stood near the doorway. "You missed the appointment," Clara said. "I know," Harrison replied. "I texted you. Work was crazy today." Clara pointed to the glass table. Dr. Sullivan printed pictures. She has 10 fingers and 10 toes. Her heart is perfect. Harrison glanced at the photos on the table. He did not step forward to pick them up. He just nodded slowly. "That is good," he said. His voice was flat. It lacked any real emotion. Clara felt a sudden surge of anger. "That is good. That is all you have to say. It is our daughter, Harrison." "I said I was sorry." "Clara," he snapped back. "I cannot control my work schedule." He walked over to his leather briefcase. He popped the brass latches open. Click, clack. He reached inside and pulled out a small, dark blue notebook. Clara recognized it instantly. It was her old planner from the previous year. She kept it in the bottom drawer of the home office desk. "Why do you have my old calendar?" Clara asked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Harrison flipped through the thick pages. He stopped near the end of the book. "I was just looking for something," he said. He avoided making eye contact. "I needed to check a date for our taxes." "In my personal planner?" Clara asked. She stood up from the sofa. The nameless anxiety in her chest turned into sharp panic. "What are you really looking for?" "Nothing," Harrison said quickly. He closed the book. "Tell me the truth," Clara demanded. Harrison sighed. He crossed his arms defensively. "Fine," he said. "I was looking at your trip to Chicago last October, the week of the sales conference." Clara stared at him in pure disbelief. "My business trip. Why?" "You had a lot of dinner meetings marked down," Harrison said. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Late dinners with male coworkers, specifically with that manager, David." The room started to spin slowly around Clara. The air grew terribly thin. "David is my regional director," Clara said. "He is 60 years old and happily married. We were working on the quarterly pitch." "It just seems like a lot of private dinners," Harrison said coldly. "Are you interrogating me?" Clara asked. Her voice trembled. "I am just asking a simple question," Harrison replied. He raised his hands in a defensive gesture. "Let us be rational about this. There is no need to get hysterical." "Do not call me hysterical," Clara said. Her tone was sharp and firm. "You are acting defensive." Harrison said, "If you have nothing to hide, you should not be upset." "I am upset because my husband is questioning my fidelity." Clara said, "I am upset because you missed seeing our child today to dig through my old calendar. This unexpected pregnancy was a huge surprise to both of us." Harrison said. He finally looked directly into her eyes. His gaze was entirely unfamiliar. It was cold and deeply suspicious. "After 3 years of trying, it just suddenly happens right after your big trip. It is a statistical anomaly." Clara felt like she had been struck in the stomach. The cruelty of his words stole the breath from her lungs. A statistical anomaly. Clara repeated softly. That is what you are calling our baby. I am just thinking logically. Harrison deflected. My mother pointed out how rare it is. Your mother, Clara said. The pieces suddenly snapped together. The mother-in-law drama was not just background noise. Margaret was actively poisoning him. Leave my mother out of this, Harrison warned. He grabbed his briefcase and the blue planner. I am going to the study. I need to get some real work done. He turned his back on her and walked away. Clara stood frozen in the living room. Her hands rested protectively over her pregnant belly. He does not believe me. He thinks I betrayed him. The thought was clear and terrifying. Clara sank back down onto the velvet sofa. She felt completely drained of energy. She looked at the ultrasound pictures resting on the glass table. The little gray smudges represented her entire future. She waited in the living room for another hour. The house was completely silent again. The rain tapped against the large front window. Clara decided she could not sleep in the same bed as him tonight. She needed to breathe. She needed to find some kind of clarity. She stood up and walked quietly down the carpeted hallway. She headed toward the guest bedroom at the back of the house. To reach the guest room, she had to pass Harrison's study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. A thin strip of yellow light spilled out onto the dark hallway carpet. Clara walked softly. She did not want him to hear her footsteps. She just wanted to pass by without another argument. As she reached the door, she heard his voice. Harrison was speaking softly, but the quiet house amplified the sound. He was on a phone call. Clara stopped moving. She stood perfectly still in the shadows. I looked at her planner. Harrison said. His voice was tired and strained. There was a pause. He was listening to the person on the other end. Yes, she was very defensive about it. Harrison continued. You were right. She got extremely angry when I brought up the dinner meetings. Clara pressed her hand against her mouth. He was talking to Margaret. I do not know what to do. Harrison said. Another long pause filled the hallway. The silence stretched tight. I know it is a difficult step, Harrison said softly. But you are right. I cannot ignore the timing. It lines up too perfectly. Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine. The chill settled deep in her bones. I will ask her for it tomorrow, Harrison said. His voice dropped lower. It became hard and completely detached. I just want to be sure it is mine before I sign the birth certificate. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She stopped breathing. The hallway seemed to tilt violently sideways. He was going to deny their child. He was going to erase 3 years of love and struggle because his mother planted a seed of doubt. Clara did not confront him. She did not push the heavy door open and scream. She turned around slowly. She walked silently into the guest bedroom. She closed the door without making a single sound. The lock turned with a tiny click. She sat on the edge of the cold bed. The room was perfectly dark. I am completely alone in this marriage. She stared into the blackness of the room. The nameless anxiety was gone. It had been replaced by a sharp, terrifying reality. The autumn rain was pouring down outside. The bright summer of her pregnant wife Joy was dead. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach. She held her baby through the fabric of her shirt. The whispers in the hall had spoken the absolute truth. Her husband was already gone. Tick, tock, tick. The tall wooden clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. The morning sun was bright, but the house felt like an icebox. Clara stood in the doorway of the master bedroom. She watched Harrison. He stood in front of the tall mirror. He was tying his expensive silk tie. He looked perfectly normal. He looked like a man going to a regular day at the office. He did not look like a man who was planning to destroy his family. I heard your conversation last night, Clara said. Her voice was calm and flat. It surprised her. She thought she would be crying. Instead, she just felt completely numb. Harrison froze. His hands stopped moving. He looked at her reflection in the mirror. "What conversation?" he asked. "The phone call with your mother," Clara replied. "I heard what you said about the birth certificate." Harrison turned around slowly. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He did not look ashamed. He looked furious. "You are sneaking around the house now?" Harrison asked. "You are eavesdropping on my private phone calls." "I was walking to the guest room," Clara said. "Here, because my husband was treating me like a criminal." "I heard you." "Harrison, you are going to deny our baby." Harrison dropped his hands to his sides. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Do not twist this around on me," he said. He pointed an accusatory finger at her. "You are the one hiding things. You are the one who has been lying to me." "I have never lied to you," Clara stated. "Let us stop playing games." "Clara," Harrison said. He walked over to his leather briefcase. He popped the brass latches open again. He reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of printer paper. He walked back across the room. He shoved the paper into Clara's hands. "I have proof," Harrison said. Clara looked down at the paper. Her hands were trembling slightly. The rough texture of the printed page felt like sandpaper against her skin. The bitter taste of bile rose sharply in the back of her throat. The strong smell of Harrison's morning coffee suddenly made her feel deeply nauseated. It was a printed email. The sender address was a random string of numbers. The recipient was Margaret. Clara read the short message. "Margaret, you need to know the truth about your daughter-in-law." Clara was not working late in Chicago. She was seen at a downtown hotel bar with her regional director. They went up to a room together. "Do the math on the pregnancy." Clara stared at the black ink on the white paper. The words made absolutely no sense. It was a complete fabrication. "This is insane," Clara whispered. "Is it?" Harrison asked. His voice was cold and demanding. "Because the dates line up perfectly. You were in Chicago. You were with David, Ted, and now you are suddenly a pregnant wife after 3 years of nothing." "Harrison, this is a fake email," Clara said. She looked him directly in the eyes. "Your mother manufactured this. She created a fake email address to send this to herself. This is nothing but toxic mother-in-law drama. Leave my mother out of this," Harrison shouted. He took a step forward. "She is just trying to protect me. She saw the signs that I was too blind to see. You are trusting an anonymous, printed email over your own wife." Clara asked. "I am looking at the facts," Harrison deflected. "Let us be rational about this. Men do not just accept things blindly anymore. I need to protect my assets. I need to protect my legacy." "Your legacy," Clara repeated softly. He threw the suitcase on the bed. He unzipped it with a loud, aggressive sound. "I want a DNA test," he said, his voice like ice. The words hung in the cold morning air. Clara looked at the open suitcase. She looked at the man she had loved for 6 years. He was completely unrecognizable. He was a stranger wearing her husband's face. She had to choose between fighting for her marriage and keeping her dignity. Both felt impossible to lose. She knew that defending herself against a lie would only validate the ridiculous accusation. Silence was her only shield. But it felt exactly like a confession. "You want a paternity test," Clara said slowly. "While I am 22 weeks pregnant." "Yes," Harrison answered. He began tossing shirts into the suitcase. "A prenatal test. They can draw your blood. They can compare it to mine. We can know the truth by next week." "The truth is already here," Clara said. "You just refuse to see it." "I will not be made a fool," Harrison said. "I will not raise another man's child." Clara felt something break deep inside her chest. It was not a loud shatter. It was a quiet, final snap. The heavy chain that tied her to this man simply dissolved. "I will not beg him to believe me. I deserve better than this. No, Clara said. Harrison stopped packing. He looked up at her. No what? No. I will not take a prenatal DNA test, Clara said. Her voice was steady and remarkably strong. I will not subject my body or my child to a medical procedure just to satisfy your mother's sick jealousy. If you refuse the test, you are admitting guilt, Harrison said. His eyes narrowed. I am admitting that I am done, Clara replied. I am admitting that our marriage is completely hollow. You never loved me. Harrison, you only love the idea of me. You are being completely unreasonable, Harrison said. He grabbed a handful of ties from the closet. If you will not take the test, I cannot look at you. I cannot be in this house. Then leave, Clara said. Harrison stared at her. He expected her to cry. He expected her to drop to her knees and beg him to stay. He expected her to offer him endless apologies. Clara did none of those things. She reached for her left hand. She grasped her diamond wedding ring. She pulled it over her knuckle. It slid off easily. Clara handed him her wedding ring. If you walk out that door, do not ever come back, Clara said. Harrison looked at the sparkling diamond in the palm of her hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, he snatched the ring from her palm. He shoved it deep into his trouser pocket. Zipped the suitcase shut. You brought this on yourself, he said. He grabbed the heavy leather handle. He walked past her without looking back. His heavy boots thudded loudly against the hardwood floor. Clara stood in the bedroom. She listened to the sounds of his departure. She heard him walk down the stairs. She heard him open the heavy oak front door. The hinges creaked. The door slammed shut. The brass deadbolt clicked. He was gone. The silence in the large house was immediate and terrifying, pressed against Clara's ears like deep water. She looked at the empty closet space where his clothes used to hang. She looked at the printed email still resting on the foot of the bed. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on her. She could not breathe. The air in the house was entirely suffocated by his betrayal. Clara grabbed her car keys from the nightstand. She turned and practically ran out of the bedroom. She hurried down the stairs. She bypassed the kitchen and went straight into the attached garage. The smell of oil and cold concrete hit her senses. She unlocked her gray sedan. The lights flashed twice in the dim garage. Clara got into the driver's seat. She slammed the door shut. She pushed the ignition button. The engine roared to life. She pressed the button to open the heavy garage door. Sunlight flooded into the dark space. Clara put the car into reverse. She backed out into the long concrete driveway. Then she stopped. She shifted the car into park. She sat in the driver's seat. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel with terrifying force. Her knuckles turned completely white. Where was she supposed to go? She was 22 weeks pregnant. Her husband had just walked out on her. Her marriage was over. Her entire future had been erased in the span of a single morning. The dashboard screen flashed a red warning light. Ding, ding, ding. It was the seatbelt warning chime. Clara had not buckled her seatbelt. The rhythmic ringing filled the quiet cabin of the car. Ding, ding, ding. Clara stared blankly through the windshield. She watched a gray squirrel run across the green lawn of her neighbor's house. The world outside was perfectly normal. The morning sun was bright and warm. People were drinking coffee and going to work. Her world had just ended. The warning chime stopped. A few seconds of heavy silence followed. Then it started again. Ding, ding, ding. Clara did not move to buckle the belt. She did not reach for the key to turn the car off. She just sat there. She let the electronic chime wash over her. It was a meaningless noise, but it anchored her to the present moment. She sat in the parked car in the driveway for 20 minutes. She listened to the seatbelt warning chime stop, then start again. Unable to turn the key or go inside, Slowly, the numbness began to fade. The ice around her heart began to crack. The, the terrible, aching pain of the falling leaves finally reached her. She rested her forehead against the cold steering wheel. I am completely alone, she whispered to the empty car. Somewhere along the way, she had become invisible to the man who promised to love her forever. Starting over felt completely impossible, but staying in that house was far worse. Clara finally reached down and pressed the engine button. The car shut off. The warning chime died instantly. The silence returned. But this time, Clara was ready for it. She took a long, deep breath. She placed both hands firmly on her pregnant belly. "It is just you and me now," Clara said out loud. It was not a question. It was a solemn, unbreakable vow. Scrub, scrub, scrub. The stiff bristles of the old toothbrush scraped against the white wood. Clara sat on the cold tile floor of the kitchen. The sharp smell of lemon bleach burned her nose. It was midnight. The house was completely silent. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner. She had spent the last 4 hours sitting in the half-painted yellow nursery. She had stared at the wet roller in the paint tray until the paint completely dried into a solid, useless block. Now, she was cleaning. She scrubbed the tiny gap between the floor and the baseboard. The soapy water turned from clear to dirty gray. Scrub, scrub, scrub. She did not cry. Her tears were frozen inside her. The physical labor was the only thing keeping her grounded. The repetitive motion gave her much-needed breathing room. It gave her space to process the massive crater in her life. She scrubbed until her knees ached against the hard tile. She scrubbed until her knuckles were red and raw. The strong lemon scent finally masked the lingering smell of Harrison's expensive cologne. He was gone. The house felt huge and entirely empty. It was a museum of a dead marriage. She wiped the baseboard clean with a dry rag. The white wood gleamed perfectly. But the foundation of the house was already broken beyond repair. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed bright red. 3 o'clock in the morning. Clara lay flat on her back in the dark guest bedroom. The air in the room was freezing. She pulled the thick cotton blanket up to her chin. Her smartphone illuminated her pale face in the pitch-black room. Her thumbs hovered over the smooth glass screen. She opened the internet browser. Her hands shook slightly. She typed a single sentence into the search bar. "How to afford a baby alone." She hit enter. Millions of results appeared instantly. She scrolled through articles about single mother budgets. She read about government assistance programs. She read forum posts about cheap diaper alternatives and subsidized childcare. A heavy wave of hot shame washed over her chest. She was a successful corporate manager. She had a solid career. But now she was a pregnant wife abandoned in the middle of the night. Her husband had left her over toxic mother-in-law drama and a fake paternity test demand. She stared at the glowing screen. The harsh reality of starting over felt completely overwhelming. She quickly closed the browser tab. She deleted her internet search history out of deep shame. The shame was a bitter pill, but the fear of the unknown was even worse. She dropped the phone onto the mattress. She stared at the dark ceiling. I cannot stay in this massive house. I cannot afford the mortgage on one salary while paying for childcare. She rolled onto her side and curled around her pregnant belly. He never trusted me, Clara whispered to the empty room. He only loved the version of me his mother approved of. Saying the words out loud made them real. The confirmation settled the terrible chaos in her mind. Clack, clack, clack. The bank manager tapped his heavy silver pen against his polished wooden desk. The air inside the bank smelled like stale coffee and fresh printer ink. Clara sat heavily in the stiff leather chair opposite him. It was 9:30 in the morning. She wore a sharp black blazer over her dark maternity dress. She needed to know exactly what financial resources she had left. I am so sorry. Mrs. Davis, the manager said. He looked deeply uncomfortable. The joint savings account is nearly empty. Clara felt the warm blood drain entirely from her face. The room suddenly felt incredibly small. Empty, Clara asked. Her voice was remarkably calm. We had over $50,000 in that account. We were saving that money specifically for the baby. The manager turned his computer monitor slightly toward her. He pointed to a highlighted line on the screen. Your husband made a major wire transfer yesterday afternoon. The manager explained gently. He moved $45,000 to an external private account. Is an account in his name only. The sheer malice of the act stole Clara's breath. He did not just demand a ridiculous DNA test. He planned to ruin her completely. He left her with exactly $5,000. It was barely enough to cover 1 month of utility bills and her upcoming medical copays. Harrison had executed a calculated strike. He wanted to leave her desperate. He wanted her to crawl back to him on her knees and beg for mercy. The manager looked at her with profound pity. Since it was a joint account, he had the legal right to move the funds without your signature. He said, I can print the transaction record for your divorce attorney. Yes, please print it. Clara replied. Her voice did not shake at all. The deep freeze was fully setting in. The hot anger of the previous day crystallized into solid, unbreakable ice. She listened to the laser printer hum in the corner of the office. The manager handed her the warm sheet of paper. Clara folded it perfectly in half. She placed it carefully into her leather purse. She stood up and smoothed her dark skirt. Thank you for your time and your help today, she said. Clara walked out of the heavy glass doors of the downtown bank. The bright morning sunlight felt harsh and entirely artificial. The loud street traffic hummed aggressively around her and sat behind the steering wheel. The leather seat was hot from the morning sun. The financial reality of becoming a single mother was utterly terrifying, but it also brought a strange, cold clarity to her mind. Harrison was actively trying to break her. Margaret had clearly taught him how to strike where it hurt the most. Charity, the mother and son duo, wanted to punish her for a crime she never committed. But they underestimated her completely. Clara placed both hands firmly on her stomach. The baby kicked strongly against her right palm. It was a tiny, solid reminder of exactly what she was fighting for. I will not let them destroy my child's future. I will rebuild everything from scratch if I have to. She started the engine. She put the car in gear and drove away from the bank. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She drove back to the large, empty house in the suburbs. She parked in the driveway and stared at the beautiful brick facade. The perfectly manicured lawn looked like a movie set. It was a fake backdrop for a fake marriage. She could not stay here. The house belonged to a ghost. The brilliant summer was long gone. The winter frost had arrived. It was time to pack her boxes. It was time to call her best friend. Beth, reap, reap, reap. The sharp sound of brown packing tape tearing off the heavy plastic roll echoed through the empty hallway. Clara pressed the sticky tape against the bottom of a large cardboard box. She smoothed it flat with her hand. The rough cardboard scraped against her skin. Dust danced in the bright shafts of afternoon sunlight. Beth stood in the kitchen doorway. She was 37 years old. She wore faded blue jeans and a plain white t-shirt. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy ponytail. Beth did not ask questions. When Clara called her that morning, Beth just listened. Then she backed her rusted pickup truck into the concrete driveway. She walked inside and handed Clara a roll of tape. I have 3 more boxes for the kitchen, Beth said. She wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. Do you want to pack the fancy plates? Leave them, Clara replied. Her voice was perfectly flat. Harrison can keep the wedding china. I only want my personal things. Okay, Beth said. She nodded slowly. I will pack the remaining pots and pans. Clara walked upstairs to the master bathroom. The room smelled faintly of lavender soap and damp towels. The large mirrors reflected her pale face. She opened the heavy mirrored door of the medicine cabinet. She needed to pack her daily toiletries. Her hand stopped in midair. Sitting on the top glass shelf were 3 bottles of Harrison's expensive cologne. The liquid inside was a dark, rich amber. Clara picked up the first heavy glass bottle. The cold glass felt smooth and heavy in her palm. She held it for a long second. She opened her hand. She let the bottle drop directly into the metal trash can on the floor. Clink! She picked up the second bottle. She dropped it. Clink. She picked up the third bottle. She let it fall. Clink. The heavy glass striking the metal sounded exactly like a funeral bell. Clara mechanically threw away the last remnants of his presence in her space. She felt absolutely nothing. The anger had completely frozen over. She was operating on pure, cold survival instinct. She grabbed her toothbrush and her face wash. She threw them into her small canvas travel bag. The truck is mostly full. Beth called from the bottom of the stairs. Clara zipped her bag closed. She walked downstairs. The house looked utterly naked. The bare walls felt cold. The brilliant summer they had shared in this house was completely dead. "Thank you for helping me," Clara said. "You do not ever need to thank me," Beth said fiercely. She put a warm hand on Clara's shoulder. "Starting over is not easy, but you are entirely capable of doing it. He is a massive fool. I am officially a single mother now," Clara said. She looked at the empty living room. "I just need to find a small apartment, somewhere safe. You are staying in my spare bedroom until you find the perfect place," Beth commanded. "I will not take no for an answer. I have a quick errand to run first," Clara said. She grabbed her purse from the kitchen counter. "I need to pick up my prescription at the pharmacy. I am almost completely out of my prenatal vitamins. I will meet you at my house," Beth said. She handed Clara her house key. Clara drove her gray sedan to the large chain pharmacy down the street. The afternoon sky was turning dark and cloudy. She walked through the sliding glass doors of the store. The bright fluorescent lights hummed loudly overhead. The strong smell of medical antiseptic and sweet peppermint candy filled the cold air. Clara walked to the tall counter at the back of the store. A young pharmacist with round glasses smiled at her. "Hello," Clara said. "I am here to pick up a prescription for Clara Davis." "Let me check that for you," the pharmacist said. He typed her name into his computer. Click, click, click. "Ah, yes," he said. He reached into a white plastic bin and pulled out a small paper bag. "Prenatal vitamins. A 30-day supply." "Thank you," Clara said. She reached into her purse to grab her wallet. The pharmacist scanned the barcode on the bag. Beep, beep. The register screen flashed a bright red error message. The pharmacist frowned slightly. He pushed his glasses up his nose. He typed something else on his keyboard. Beep, beep. "I am sorry, ma'am," the pharmacist said. He looked confused. "The system is rejecting your insurance card." Clara stopped unzipping her wallet. A cold chill ran down her spine. "That cannot be right," Clara said. "My husband's corporate policy covers all my maternity care. We just used it last month. Let me run it one more time," the pharmacist said kindly. He scanned the card again. Beep, beep. "I am so sorry," he said. His voice dropped to an apologetic whisper. "The system says the policyholder terminated your coverage yesterday afternoon. Your health insurance has been completely canceled." The humiliating beep of the pharmacy register echoed loudly in Clara's ears. A sudden flush of intense heat rushed directly to her pale cheeks. She felt the heavy gaze of the 3 people standing in line behind her. She could feel them staring at her pregnant belly. "He canceled my health insurance. He completely abandoned his pregnant wife." The reality of Harrison's cruelty was breathtaking. He had drained their bank account. He had demanded a DNA test. Now, he had stripped her of her medical safety net. He wanted her to feel completely helpless. Clara gripped the edge of the laminate counter. Her knuckles turned stark white. Her chest tightened painfully. She wanted to scream. She wanted to collapse onto the linoleum floor and sob until her lungs burned. She took a slow, deep breath. The smell of antiseptic grounded her. I will not cry in public. I will not give him the satisfaction of breaking me. Clara stood up perfectly straight. She looked the young pharmacist directly in the eyes. How much does the prescription cost without the insurance coverage? Clara asked. Her voice was firm and completely steady. It is $120 out of pocket, he replied nervously. Clara pulled her debit card from her wallet. She handed it across the counter. Run the card, please, she said. The pharmacist swiped the card. The machine printed a long white receipt. He handed her the small paper bag. Thank you, Clara said. She put the bag in her purse. She turned around and walked out of the store. She kept her head held high. She did not look at the people standing in line. Her flat black shoes clicked loudly against the hard floor. She walked out into the cool evening air. The cloudy sky threatened rain. Clara got into her car and locked the doors. She sat in the quiet cabin for a long moment. Tom. She looked at the white pharmacy bag sitting on the passenger seat. She had just spent a large portion of her remaining cash. The road ahead was going to be incredibly difficult. She would have to find a new doctor. She would have to navigate the public health system. She would have to budget every single penny she earned. But as she sat there in the fading light, Clara felt a sudden surge of immense power. She had survived the worst blow he could deliver. She was still breathing. She was still standing. Harrison thought he was punishing her, but he was actually setting her free. I will never ask him for a single dime, Clara said aloud to the empty car. I will build a beautiful life for my daughter completely on my own. She pressed the start button. The engine hummed faithfully to life. Clara put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. She drove toward Beth's house, leaving her broken past entirely behind her. Crash! The loud thunder shook the thin window panes of the small apartment. Clara stood in the tiny kitchen. She was 34 weeks pregnant. The winter storm outside was brutal. Sleet hit the glass like thousands of tiny rocks. The wind howled loudly around the brick building. She poured a glass of cold water. The sharp pain tore through Clara's back. She dropped the glass. It shattered completely on the cheap linoleum floor. The loud crash echoed in the small room. She was only 34 weeks along, but the baby was coming now. Warm fluid rushed down her legs. Her water had broken. Her heart began to race with sudden panic. She grabbed her cell phone from the counter. She dialed Beth's number with shaking fingers. The phone rang 3 times. Beth, Clara said, the baby is coming right now. I am on my way. Beth replied instantly. I will drive you to the hospital. The roads are completely flooded. Clara said, I am closer to the hospital. I will drive myself and meet you there. Please be careful. Beth said, drive slowly. Clara hung up the phone. Another massive contraction hit her stomach. She doubled over in agonizing pain. She gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. She grabbed her heavy winter coat from the chair. She picked up her car keys. Then, she noticed the small vanilla candle burning on the coffee table, even in the middle of a medical emergency. She could not leave the house without making sure the fire hazard was handled. The absurd autopilot of adult responsibility forced her to stop. She leaned over and blew out the small flame. The thin line of gray smoke drifted into the cold air. The sweet smell of vanilla mixed with her fear. The freezing sleet hit her face as she walked to her car. The parking lot was entirely dark. The streetlights had gone out in the storm. The icy wind cut through her thick coat. Clara got into the driver's seat. She started the engine. She turned the heat on high. The storm howled outside as she gripped the steering wheel. Driving herself to the hospital in the dark, Just. The leather steering wheel felt freezing cold beneath her bare hands. The windshield wipers slapped aggressively back and forth. Squeak, squeak. They struggled to clear the heavy, wet snow. Blinding flash of lightning lit up the empty city streets. Loud thunder followed a second later. Trit. Another massive contraction ripped through her lower back. It felt like her body was splitting in half. She bit her lower lip so hard she tasted copper blood. I am not going to die tonight. I am going to save my daughter. She drove through 3 red traffic lights. There were no other cars on the road. The world felt completely abandoned. She was navigating the longest winter night of her entire life. The hospital emergency sign finally glowed bright red in the distance. The red light reflected on the wet asphalt. Clara pulled her car right up to the glass entrance doors. She threw the gear into park. She pressed her hand firmly on the horn. Honk, honk, honk. 2 nurses rushed out into the freezing rain. They brought a silver wheelchair. They helped Clara out of the warm car and into the freezing weather. The hospital room was bright white. It smelled strongly of harsh chemical bleach and clean linens. The fluorescent lights hummed loudly above the narrow bed. The medical monitors beeped in a steady, fast rhythm. Clara wore a thin cotton hospital gown. Her body was shaking violently from the adrenaline and the cold. The physical pain was completely overwhelming. Beth burst through the heavy wooden door. She was soaking wet from the pouring rain. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. She ran straight to the side of the bed. I am right here, Beth said. She grabbed Clara's right hand tightly. You are doing perfectly. Dr. Sullivan walked quickly into the room. He wore blue surgical scrubs and a calm expression. Hello again, Clara, Dr. Sullivan said. Your baby girl is in a big hurry tonight. It hurts too much, Clara said. She gasped for air. It is too early for her to come. You are at 34 weeks, Dr. Sullivan replied calmly. Her lungs are developed enough. We are ready for her. Now I need you to push on the next contraction. The pain peaked again. It was a massive, crushing wave of agony. Clara squeezed Beth's hand with terrifying strength. She pushed with every ounce of energy she had left in her exhausted body. The physical and emotional pain merged into one solid feeling. She was giving birth completely without her husband. The man who promised to protect her was absent. He was entirely missing from the most important moment of their lives. I do not need him. I have all the strength I need right here. One more big push. Clara, Dr. Sullivan said loudly. I can see her head. Clara took a deep, ragged breath. She screamed loudly as she pushed one final time. The sound echoed off the bare hospital walls. The pain suddenly vanished. A strange, heavy emptiness replaced it. Wah, 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 the sharp, beautiful cry of a newborn baby pierced the quiet room. It was the loudest, most wonderful sound Clara had ever heard. Clara fell back against the pillows. She was completely exhausted. Sweat coated her forehead. Warm tears streamed freely down her face. She is absolutely perfect, Dr. Sullivan said. He held the tiny, squirming baby up for Clara to see. The nurse quickly wiped the baby with a soft white towel. She wrapped the infant in a warm striped blanket. She carried the small bundle to the head of the narrow bed. The nurse placed the baby gently onto Clara's bare chest. Clara looked down at her beautiful daughter. The baby had a full head of dark hair. She felt incredibly warm against Clara's skin. The tiny chest rose and fell rapidly. The baby smelled like warm milk and clean soap. Hello, little Nora, Clara whispered. She stroked the baby's soft cheek with one trembling finger. When they laid the crying baby on her chest, Clara realized she did not need him. She never did. The long winter night was finally over. She had survived the massive storm entirely on her own. Beth leaned over and kissed Clara's sweaty forehead. You did it, Beth said softly. She is absolutely beautiful. Clara closed her eyes. The sound of her daughter's tiny breaths was the only thing that mattered. The world outside the hospital room did not exist. Harrison did not exist. The awful mother-in-law drama did not matter anymore. There was only Clara and Nora. A profound sense of peace settled deep into her tired bones. The winter storm continued to rage violently outside the hospital windows. But inside the bright room, Clara had found her ultimate sanctuary. The solid foundation of her new life as a single mother was officially built. Click. The heavy plastic buckle snapped loudly into the solid metal base. Clara stood in the cold hospital parking garage. The air smelled strongly of heavy exhaust fumes and damp concrete. The brutal winter storm had finally passed. The late afternoon sun was pale but warm against her tired face. She pulled the infant car seat out of the gray sedan. She placed it carefully on the concrete floor. Then, she picked it up and locked it into the base again. Click. She unhooked it. She locked it in again. Click. Clara practiced putting the baby car seat into the back of her sedan 5 times in a row. She made sure the sharp sound was absolutely perfect every single time. She trusted no one but herself. Nora slept soundly inside the padded carrier. She wore a thick pink coat. Her tiny face was peaceful. Beth stood a few feet away. She leaned against the side of the car. She watched Clara with a proud smile. "You have got it down perfectly," Beth said. "The seat is not going anywhere." "I have to be sure," Clara replied. "It is just the two of us now. I have to protect her." Clara closed the heavy car door. She hugged Beth tightly. "Thank you for staying with me at the hospital," Clara said. "You saved my life. You saved your own life." Beth said gently, "I just held your hand. Call me when you get back to your apartment." Clara drove home slowly. The city streets were still covered in dirty white snow. She parked in front of her small brick building. She carried the heavy car seat up 2 flights of stairs. Her body ached deeply from the difficult birth. Every step sent a dull pain through her back. But she did not stop. She unlocked her apartment door. She stepped inside her new sanctuary. Hum! The small white humidifier buzzed quietly in the corner of the bedroom. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The tiny apartment was completely dark. The tall street lights outside cast long, thin shadows across the painted walls. Clara sat in a wooden rocking chair. The chair creaked softly with her weight. Creak, creak. She held Nora against her warm chest. The baby smelled like sweet milk and lavender baby lotion. The softness of her daughter's tiny breathing was a perfect, steady rhythm. Clara closed her eyes. She felt pure, quiet peace. This was her breathing space. The massive house with the yellow nursery seemed like a distant, faded memory. The horrible trauma of the mother-in-law drama vanished entirely in the dark room. "I am strong enough to do this alone. I am a good mother." The inner thought was a solid, absolute fact. She rocked back and forth. The snow outside was finally beginning to melt. The ice around her heart was thawing into a deep, quiet strength. Reap! The loud tearing sound of the Velcro blood pressure cuff filled the room. The examination room at the corporate health clinic was painfully bright. It smelled strongly of rubbing alcohol and clean paper. Harrison sat on the edge of the examination table. His expensive gray suit pants were badly wrinkled. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He looked completely exhausted. Dark purple bags hung heavily under his red eyes. Dr. Sullivan walked into the small room. He held a thick yellow medical file. The doctor looked at Harrison with a very professional, distant expression. "Hello, Harrison," Dr. Sullivan said. "Your blood pressure is quite elevated today. You need to reduce your stress. Work has been extremely demanding lately." Harrison lied smoothly. He rubbed his aching temples. "Let us review your routine blood work," Dr. Sullivan said. He opened the file. "Your cholesterol levels are fine. But I noticed something very interesting in your laboratory results today." Is something wrong with me? Harrison asked. His voice cracked slightly with sudden fear. No, Dr. Sullivan replied. You are completely healthy, but you have the AB negative blood type. It is an extremely rare type. Less than 1% of the population carries it. Harrison nodded slowly. Yes, I know that. My mother always told me that my father had the exact same rare blood type. Dr. Sullivan paused. Here. He looked closely at the printed paper in his hands. He frowned slightly. That is medically fascinating, Dr. Sullivan said. Why is that fascinating? Harrison asked. Because genetics are very specific, Dr. Sullivan replied. Two parents with typical blood types do not usually produce an AB negative child. It is a very distinct genetic marker. Harrison stared at the white wall. His mind began to race. He thought about the terrible day he demanded a paternity test from Clara. Clust. He thought about the anonymous email his mother had printed out. Can you tell exactly who someone is related to from a blood test? Harrison asked. You need a proper DNA test for absolute certainty, Dr. Sullivan said. He closed the yellow file with a soft thud. But rare blood types are very hard to hide. They leave a very clear family trail. Dr. Sullivan walked out of the room. Harrison sat alone on the table. Tiny seed of doubt planted itself deep in his mind. The doubt was not about Clara. The doubt was suddenly about his own mother. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The black ink pen moved quickly across the thick white paper. Clara sat at her small kitchen table. The bright morning sun warmed her tired shoulders. A ceramic cup of black coffee steamed softly next to her left hand. She was filling out the official birth certificate and custody paperwork. She reached the section for the father's legal information. She stared at the empty white boxes. She thought about the empty bank account. She thought about the canceled health insurance. She thought about driving herself through the brutal winter storm while having massive contractions. She felt absolutely no anger anymore. She only felt a cold, incredibly clear focus. Clara moved her pen down to the bottom of the long page. She found the small square checkbox labeled Father Absent. She marked the box with a thick, heavy black X. She signed her full name on the bottom line of the legal document. Clara filed for full legal custody without a single second of hesitation. She folded the thick papers carefully. She placed them inside a large brown envelope. She took a slow sip of her hot coffee. The bitter liquid tasted like absolute freedom. The terrible thread of Harrison's control was officially cut. She was a single mother. She was completely independent. The brilliant spring was still far away. But the first green sprouts of her new life were finally pushing through the cold dirt. Squeak, squeak. The heavy rubber soles of Harrison's expensive shoes slipped on the wet asphalt. He stood in the crowded parking lot of the local grocery store. The gray sky was heavy with dark clouds. The smell of wet pavement and car exhaust filled the cold air. He watched from behind a large concrete pillar. Beth walked out of the sliding glass doors of the store. She carried 2 heavy plastic bags of groceries. Beth walked over to her rusted pickup truck. She unlocked the heavy door. She tossed the bags into the passenger seat. She left the window rolled down halfway. Then, she walked around to the back of the truck to secure the tailgate. Harrison moved quickly. His heart pounded rapidly in his chest. His breathing was shallow and fast. He crept up to the side of the truck. He looked through the open window. A soft pink diaper bag sat on the floorboard. Next to the bag was a tiny, clear plastic pacifier. It had fallen out of the side pocket. Harrison reached his shaking hand through the open window. His knuckles scraped against the cold glass. He grabbed the small pacifier. The soft silicone tip felt strangely heavy in his large palm. He pulled his hand back. He shoved the pacifier deep into his coat pocket. He turned and practically ran back to his own vehicle. He felt completely pathetic. He was a wealthy corporate executive sneaking around a grocery store parking lot. But his terrible paranoia gave him absolutely no choice. He got into his car and locked the doors. He pulled a small plastic bag from the glove compartment. He dropped the stolen pacifier inside. He sealed the bag tightly. He was finally going to get his DNA test. He drove straight to a private medical laboratory downtown. Cuckoo, the soft, happy sound echoed gently in the small apartment. Clara sat on the edge of her comfortable sofa. The bright afternoon sun poured through the clean window. The room smelled like fresh lemon cleaner and warm laundry. Nora lay on a soft green playmat on the floor. She kicked her tiny legs happily in the air. Clara smiled down at her beautiful daughter. She was folding a pile of tiny white cotton onesies. The fabric was incredibly soft against her fingertips. The terrible anxiety of the past few months was completely gone. Clara did not wonder where Harrison was. She did not wonder what he was doing. She did not care if he ever discovered the truth. The long winter of her pain had finally melted away. "I do not need an apology," Clara said softly to the quiet room. "I only need peace." The words felt absolutely solid in her mind. It was a firm declaration of her new reality. She had built a safe fortress for herself and her child. No toxic mother-in-law drama could ever reach them here. She picked up a tiny pink sock. She smiled as she folded it perfectly in half. Her life was finally her own. The large server tower on Harrison's massive desk buzzed aggressively. It was 8 o'clock at night. The corporate office building was completely empty. The dark room was illuminated only by the stark blue light of his large computer monitor. The air smelled of stale, cold coffee and dry paper. Harrison sat in his heavy leather chair. Tie was entirely removed. His collar was open. Sweat beaded on his pale forehead. He stared at the medical laboratory web portal on his screen. The results of the private paternity test were scheduled to arrive tonight. His thumb hovered over the mouse button. Click. He refreshed the online portal. Small blue circles spun on the screen. Spin, spin, spin. The page loaded. Status still read pending. Harrison let out a shaky breath. He wiped his sweaty palms on his dark trousers. He stared at the screen for 10 seconds. Click. He refreshed the portal again. The blue circle spun. Spin, spin, spin. Pending. He was trapped in a terrible cycle of absolute panic. He felt like he was suffocating in the quiet office. He dragged his thumb down the side of the mouse. Thumb down. Spin. Refresh. Pending. Thumb down. Spin. Refresh. Pending. Thumb down. Spin. Refresh. The screen flashed bright white. The page reloaded completely. The word pending disappeared. A thick PDF document icon appeared in its place. The results were finally here. Harrison stopped breathing. The blood rushed violently in his ears. His hand shook so badly he could barely move the cursor. He double-clicked the document icon. Click, click. The white page opened slowly on the bright screen. Thick black text filled the document. Harrison scrolled frantically past the medical jargon. He dragged the page down to the final conclusion at the very bottom. The words were printed in bold black letters. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Harrison stared at the numbers. The numbers did not change. They burned themselves permanently into his retinas. 99.9%. He is the father. Nora is his biological daughter. A massive, invisible weight crashed down directly onto his chest. He could not pull air into his lungs. Catch. He pushed his chair back violently. The wheels shrieked against the plastic floor mat. He had abandoned his pregnant wife. He had emptied their bank account. He had canceled her health insurance. He had left her to give birth completely alone in a terrible winter storm. He did all of that to the mother of his own child. Oh my God. Harrison whispered. The sound was broken and completely hollow. He grabbed the edge of his wooden desk to steady himself. The room was spinning wildly. The terrible truth hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Clara had told the absolute truth. She had never cheated on him. She had never lied. Harrison suddenly remembered the email. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out the crumpled sheet of printer paper. It was the anonymous message his mother had given him. The message that claimed Clara was at a hotel with her boss. He smoothed the wrinkled paper flat on his desk. He looked closely at the very top line of the printed page. It showed the original internet routing information. It showed a long string of numbers, the IP address. Harrison turned back to his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Clack, clack, clack. He opened a public IP tracking website. He typed the long string of numbers exactly as they appeared on the printed page. He hit the enter key. The website processed the numbers for 2 seconds. Then, a large digital map appeared on the screen. A bright red pin dropped onto the map. The pin pointed to a specific residential neighborhood. It zoomed in closer. It showed the exact street name. Harrison stared at the bright red pin. The absolute worst realization of his entire life washed over him. The pin was resting directly on his mother's house. The terrible manipulation was completely exposed. Margaret had created the fake email account. Margaret had written the terrible lies. Margaret had printed the email from her own home computer. She had deliberately framed Clara to destroy their happy marriage. Harrison felt violently ill. The bitter taste of pure regret flooded his mouth. He had thrown away his entire life. He had destroyed a beautiful, loyal wife. He had missed the birth of his only daughter. He had completely ruined his own legacy. And he did it all because he chose to blindly trust his mother's toxic jealousy over his wife's honest word. He looked at the paternity test results again. 99.9%. He grabbed the piece of paper. He crumpled it tightly in his large fist. He had to fix this. He had to make it right. He had to find Clara and beg her for a second chance. Harrison grabbed his coat and ran out of the dark office. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him. The loud sound echoed through the empty hallway, signaling the complete collapse of his arrogant delusion. Bam, bam, bam. Harrison pounded his heavy fist against the solid oak door. The heavy rain poured down from the black night sky. The freezing water soaked his hair and his expensive gray suit. He stood on the front porch of his mother's large suburban house. The porch light flicked on. The lock clicked open. Margaret stood in the doorway. She wore a silk robe. The strong smell of heavy lavender perfume wafted out into the cold air. "Harrison?" Margaret asked. She looked deeply confused by his wet, disheveled appearance. "What on earth are you doing here at this hour?" Harrison pushed past her. He walked directly into the bright, warm foyer. His wet shoes squeaked loudly against the polished marble floor. Squeak, squeak. "Harrison, you are tracking mud everywhere," Margaret said. She pulled her silk robe tighter around her chest. Harrison reached into his wet coat pocket. He pulled out the crumpled piece of printer paper. It was the anonymous email about Clara. He pulled out the second paper. It was the printed map with the bright red location pin. He threw both papers onto the glass entryway table. They landed with a soft slap. "I know what you did," Harrison said. His voice was shaking with absolute fury. Margaret looked down at the papers. She did not touch them. She looked back up at her son. Her face remained perfectly smooth and completely calm. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Margaret replied. She used her most dismissive, aristocratic tone. "Do not lie to me," Harrison shouted. The loud sound echoed off the high ceiling. I tracked the computer address from that fake email. It came directly from this house. You wrote those horrible lies about Clara." Margaret lifted her chin slightly. She realized she was caught, but she did not apologize. She immediately shifted the blame. "I did it for your own good," Margaret said smoothly. "You were completely blind. Harrison, she was changing you. She was taking you away from your family." "She was my family," Harrison fired back. His chest heaved with heavy, panicked breaths. "She was carrying my child." You could not be sure of that. Margaret deflected quickly. She traveled constantly. She was far too independent for a proper wife. I, I just wanted you to open your eyes to the possibilities. The baby is mine, Harrison said. The words tore roughly out of his throat. I stole a pacifier and ran a private DNA test today. Nora is my biological daughter. She is 99.9% a match to me. Margaret blinked twice. A tiny flash of surprise crossed her cold eyes. Well, Margaret said. She adjusted the belt of her silk robe. That is certainly a relief. Now you can arrange for proper custody. You can raise the child with my help. We do not need Clara in the picture. Harrison stared at his mother. He finally saw her for what she truly was. She was not a protective parent. She was a deeply toxic, selfish woman who destroyed anything she could not completely control. You are a monster, Harrison whispered. I am your mother, Margaret said sharply. Do not speak to me with such disrespect. Everything I did to protect our legacy. There is no legacy left, Harrison said. You ruined my marriage. You made me abandon my pregnant wife. You made me miss the birth of my only child. He turned his back on her. He walked toward the open front door. Harrison, Margaret called out. Her voice finally held a note of actual panic. Where are you going? I am going to find my wife, Harrison replied. He stepped out into the pouring rain. And you are never going to see me or my daughter ever again. Do not ever call my phone. He did not look back. He walked to his car. The heavy rain washed the smell of her suffocating lavender perfume completely away. Swoosh, swoosh. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the massive downpour. Harrison drove dangerously fast across the dark city. The streetlights blurred into long streaks of yellow against the wet glass. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his hands cramped in deep pain. He had to fix this. He had to show Clara the test results. He had to explain that his mother was the real villain. He had to beg for her absolute forgiveness. He pulled his sleek black car into the small parking lot of Clara's apartment building. He threw the car into park. He did not bother to turn off the engine. Harrison ran through the freezing rain. The cold wind bit aggressively through his wet clothes. He reached her ground floor apartment. He stood on the small concrete welcome mat. He raised his heavy fist. Knock, knock, knock. He pounded on the wooden door. The sound was loud over the rushing rain. He waited 10 seconds. The porch light clicked on above his head. The bright yellow light illuminated the pouring rain. The brass deadbolt turned with a sharp snap. The door opened slowly. Clara stood in the warm doorway. She wore a thick, oversized gray wool sweater. Her dark hair was tied back in a neat braid. She looked incredibly warm. She looked perfectly calm. She held little Nora against her chest. The baby was sleeping peacefully in a soft white blanket. Harrison looked at his beautiful wife and his perfect daughter. The physical pain of his massive regret brought him instantly to his knees. His knees slammed hard into the wet concrete of the porch. The rough stone tore the expensive fabric of his suit pants. The freezing puddles soaked directly through to his bare skin. He did not care about the pain. He did not care about the rain. He held up the crumpled DNA test paper in his shaking hand. Clara, Harrison sobbed. The sound was pathetic and deeply broken. Clara, please. Clara did not step back. She did not look surprised. Thus, she looked down at him with a completely unreadable expression. I am so sorry, Harrison begged. Tears mixed freely with the cold rain on his face. I was so wrong. My mother faked the emails. She set the entire thing up. I got the test results today. She is mine. Nora is my daughter. He held the wet paper higher. He wanted her to take it. He wanted her to read the scientific proof. Clara did not reach for the paper. I know, Clara said. Her voice was steady and quiet over the sound of the heavy storm. Please forgive me, Harrison cried. He gripped the wet edge of the concrete welcome mat. Let me come inside. Let me be a father. I will give you anything you want. We can start completely over. Clara looked at the man, crying at her feet. She remembered the day he drained their joint bank account. She remembered the humiliating beep at the pharmacy counter. She remembered driving herself through the winter storm in agonizing pain. She felt absolutely no anger. She only felt a mild, distant pity. You do not understand, Harrison, Clara said softly. I do understand now, he pleaded. I know you never lied to me. I knew the truth the whole time, Clara said. Her calm voice cut cleanly through his desperate panic. I never needed a piece of paper to tell me who I am. And your paper means nothing here. Harrison froze. His mouth hung slightly open. But I love you, Harrison whispered. No, you do not, Clara replied. You love the comfort I provided. You chose to believe a lie because it was easier than trusting your wife. You threw us away without a second thought. I can change, he begged. You cannot change the past, Clara said. She adjusted the sleeping baby in her warm arms. You made your choice months ago. My daughter and I are perfectly fine without you. Clara, please do not do this. Harrison sobbed loudly. I am on my knees. You can stay on your knees as long as you want, Clara said. But you cannot come inside my home. She took one step backward into the warm, bright apartment. She looked at him one final time. Goodbye, Harrison, Clara said. She pushed the heavy wooden door forward. Click, the lock snapped firmly into place. The bright porch light turned off. Harrison was plunged back into complete darkness. He knelt on the freezing concrete in the pouring rain. He stared at the locked door. He clutched the wet, useless DNA paper against his chest. The main conflict of his life was entirely over, and he had completely lost. Inside the apartment, Clara walked slowly into the small kitchen. She placed the sleeping baby gently into a secure bassinet in the living room. She walked to the stainless steel kitchen sink. She turned the metal handle. The hot water rushed out of the faucet. Splash, splash. Clara pumped 3 drops of blue dish soap directly into her palms. She rubbed her hands together vigorously under the running water. Scrub, scrub. She washed her hands with the hot water and the strong soap. She was methodically scrubbing away the feeling of the freezing rain. She was scrubbing away the heavy, suffocating memory of his physical presence on her welcome mat. The thick white bubbles rinsed cleanly down the metal drain. My peace is worth infinitely more than his desperate apology. The thought was bright and perfectly clear. She reached for a clean cotton towel. She dried her hands thoroughly. She walked back to the living room. The apartment was perfectly quiet. Storm raged outside, but none of the cold wind could penetrate her walls. She sat down in the rocking chair next to her sleeping daughter. Clara closed her eyes and took a long, deep breath. The confrontation she had waited months for was finally over. The early winter frost was completely gone. She had kept her absolute dignity while he collapsed in the mud. She had won her complete freedom. Ding! The polished silver doors of the elevator slid smoothly open. Clara stepped out onto the executive floor of her office building. The bright morning sun poured completely through the massive glass windows. The high ceiling made the space feel incredibly open. The air smelled of fresh roasted coffee and expensive leather. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. Her dark hair fell in soft, loose waves over her shoulders. She carried a sleek black leather briefcase in her right hand. She walked with excellent posture and total confidence. It had been exactly 6 months since Harrison fell to his knees in the freezing rain. It had been 6 months since she locked the heavy wooden door on her broken past. Life had moved forward with beautiful, steady momentum. She was completely thriving in her career. She was the new regional director of her company. She had earned the exact promotion that originally caused all the terrible mother-in-law drama. She had turned the worst accusation of her life into a stepping stone for massive success. Her heels clicked sharply against the shiny marble floor. Click, clack, click. It was the sound of a woman completely in control of her own destiny. Tess. Clara walked into the busy corner cafe across the street from her office. The loud hiss of the hot espresso machine filled the warm air. Hiss, sputter. The rich smell of cinnamon and baked pastry made her stomach rumble happily. Beth sat at a small wooden table near the large front window. She was drinking a large iced tea. She smiled widely when she saw Clara approach. "Look at the big corporate boss," Beth said happily. "You look absolutely incredible today." "Thank you," Clara replied. She sat down in the comfortable wooden chair. She placed her briefcase on the floor. "I finally feel like myself again. I got 8 full hours of sleep last night." "How is my beautiful goddaughter doing?" Beth asked. "Nora is perfect," Clara said. Her face immediately lit up with a massive smile. "She is in the premium daycare downstairs. She learned how to roll completely over yesterday morning. She is growing so fast." A young waiter walked over to their table. Clara ordered a hot green tea and a fresh blueberry muffin. "So, tell me the final news," Beth said. She leaned forward across the small table. "Did the lawyers finally finish everything?" "Yes," Clara said. She took a deep breath. "The divorce attorney called me an hour ago. The judge signed the final papers this morning. It is officially over." "How did Harrison react to the final terms?" Beth asked. "He surrendered completely," Clara replied. Her voice was remarkably calm. "His lawyer tried to suggest mandatory marriage counseling a few months ago. He said Harrison wanted to work through the emotional affair trauma. I told them absolutely not. I refused to entertain his delusions." He really thought you would go to counseling after everything he did?" Beth asked. She shook her head in pure disbelief. "He was desperate," Clara said. "But he finally realized I was never coming back. So he stopped fighting the custody arrangement. I have sole legal and physical custody of Nora." The waiter returned with Clara's hot tea and the warm muffin. The ceramic cup clinked softly against the small saucer. Clink. "What about the financial settlement?" Beth asked. She took a sip of her cold drink. "He is paying $3,000 a month in child support," Clara said. She broke off a small piece of the sweet muffin. "But I do not touch a single penny of his money for our daily expenses. Every single dollar goes directly into a locked trust fund for Nora. She will get it when she turns 25 years old." "That is brilliant," Beth said. "You are completely independent." Starting over was terrifying at first, Clara admitted honestly. "Being a single mother is the hardest job in the entire world. But I built this new life with my own 2 hands. He cannot take credit for any of our happiness." "Have you heard anything about Margaret?" Beth asked cautiously. Clara took a slow sip of her hot tea. The green tea was perfectly bitter and warm. "My divorce attorney mentioned it in passing," Clara said. "Harrison refuses to speak to his mother. He sold his massive house in the suburbs. He moved to a small apartment closer to his office. Margaret is entirely alone in her big house. Her toxic manipulation cost her her only son and her only grandchild. She got exactly what she deserved," Beth said firmly. "And you got your absolute freedom." "Yes," Clara said. "I really did." They finished their lunch in completely happy silence. They watched the busy city street outside the large glass window. People hurried past the cafe, carrying umbrellas and heavy briefcases. The world was full of endless motion and beautiful possibilities. Heart. Clara walked back to her office building a little while later. The warm afternoon sun heated the busy concrete sidewalks. She rode the silver elevator down to the ground floor. She walked into the bright, colorful daycare center. "Hello, Clara," the cheerful daycare teacher said. "Nora just woke up from her nap. Clara walked over to the soft blue playpens. Nora was sitting up slightly, chewing happily on a small rubber toy. When she saw Clara, her tiny face broke into a massive, toothless smile. "Hello, my beautiful girl," Clara whispered. She picked her daughter up. She held her tightly against her chest. The warm, familiar smell of baby lotion instantly calmed Clara's busy mind. Nora giggled softly and grabbed a strand of Clara's dark hair. Looking back on the terrible events of the past year, Clara finally saw the absolute truth. Harrison's lack of trust was never a reflection of her own character. It was entirely a reflection of his own hollow core. She had spent years trying to fill a cup that had a massive hole in the bottom. She had tried so hard to be the perfect pregnant wife. She had compromised her own boundaries to keep his mother happy. She finally understood that the prison door had been unlocked the entire time. She had been her own jailer. Losing her husband was the painful price she had to pay to finally meet her true self. She was no longer a victim. She was the absolute winner of her own story. Clara carried Nora out to her parked car. She secured the infant seat carefully. Click, click. She drove away from the tall office buildings. She headed toward the large public park near their apartment. The spring weather was absolutely gorgeous. The tall green trees rustled softly in the warm afternoon breeze. Swish, swish. Bright yellow and purple flowers bloomed wildly along the winding walking paths. Clara pushed the sleek black stroller along the smooth concrete path. The rubber wheels hummed quietly. She stopped near a large wooden bench to check on Nora. The baby was kicking her little legs happily in the warm air. Clara noticed something. She reached down into the stroller. She adjusted the baby's tiny pink cotton sock. It kept slipping completely off the left heel. Clara pulled the soft fabric up. 3 seconds later, Nora kicked her foot. The sock slipped right back down. Clara laughed out loud. It was a tiny, entirely mundane frustration, but it grounded her completely in the beautiful present moment. There were no terrible secrets looming over her. There were no false accusations waiting at home. There was only the gentle sunshine and a stubborn little pink sock. "You are a very active girl today," Clara said smoothly. She pulled the tiny sock off entirely. She tucked it carefully into her coat pocket. She continued walking down the wide park path. A large golden retriever suddenly trotted happily around the corner. The dog had a bright red collar. Its tail wagged frantically in the warm air. "Rex, come back here," a deep, friendly voice called out. A tall man jogged lightly around the corner. He wore a gray running shirt and dark athletic shorts. He had kind brown eyes and a very warm, relaxed smile. He looked to be about 38 years old. The golden retriever stopped right in front of Clara's stroller. The dog sat down nicely and looked up at the baby. Nora let out a loud, happy squeal. "I am so sorry," the handsome man said. He walked over and gently grabbed the dog's red leash. "He absolutely loves babies. I hope he did not scare you." "Not at all," Clara replied. She smiled genuinely. "My daughter seems to think he is quite funny." The man looked at Clara. His brown eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. He really noticed her. He did not look at her with suspicion or toxic judgment. He looked at her with polite, genuine interest. "It is a beautiful afternoon for a walk," the man said. "It really is the perfect day." Clara said. "I am Mark," he said. He offered a quick, polite nod. "I am Clara," she replied. They stood there for a brief, comfortable moment in the bright sunshine. The golden retriever panted happily at their feet. The warm breeze rustled the green leaves above their heads. There was no immediate rush of intense romance. There was no desperate need to fall completely in love. Clara did not need a man to save her anymore. She had already saved herself. But the polite, friendly interaction felt incredibly nice. It was a gentle reminder that the world was still full of good, normal people. It was a quiet promise that her future was entirely open to new possibilities. "Well, it was very nice to meet you, Clara," Mark said warmly. He tugged gently on the red leash. "Come on, Rex. Let us finish our run." "Have a wonderful afternoon," Clara said. Mark smiled one final time. He jogged slowly down the winding path. The happy golden retriever trotted faithfully beside him. Clara watched them go. She took a deep, refreshing breath of the sweet spring air. She looked down at her beautiful daughter. Nora was watching a small yellow butterfly flutter past the edge of the stroller. The baby's bright eyes were full of absolute wonder. Clara grasped the handle of the black stroller. She pushed it forward into the bright, warm sunshine. She did not know exactly what the future held for them. She did not know if she would ever marry again. She did not know where her corporate career would take her next. But for the very first time in her entire life, she was completely fine with the unknown. The dark winter of betrayal was permanently behind them. Her life had completely blossomed in a direction she never dared to dream. The quiet joy in her heart was solid, absolute, and completely unbreakable. Clara smiled up at the brilliant blue sky, feeling absolutely certain that every beautiful thing was finally possible.
Clara's journey is a profound exploration of what happens when the foundation of a marriage is built on conditional trust rather than unconditional love. The true tragedy of Harrison is not just that he lost his family, but that he allowed his mother's toxic jealousy to overwrite 6 years of lived reality. He chose the manipulative whispers of a jealous woman over the undeniable truth of his own wife's character. This story teaches us a harsh but necessary lesson. You cannot build a secure future with someone who is constantly looking for a reason to doubt you. Clara spent years trying to fit into a mold created by her mother-in-law, twisting her own boundaries to keep the peace in a house that never truly felt like hers. But peace bought at the expense of your own dignity is just a quietly ticking time bomb. The moment the storm hit, Harrison didn't step up to protect her. He became the storm himself. Yet, the absolute beauty and core value of this narrative lies in Clara's rebirth. When she was stripped of everything, her financial security, her medical safety net, and her partner she didn't break, the very actions meant to destroy her ended up forging an unbreakable armor. She birthed her child in the midst of a literal and metaphorical winter storm, proving that all the strength she ever needed was already inside her. When they placed little Nora on her chest, Clara realized a fundamental truth. She never needed Harrison. She had been her own savior all along. Margaret, the mother-in-law, represents the insidious nature of control dressed up as maternal protection. She destroyed her own legacy simply because she could not stand to share it. And Harrison learned the ultimate price of weak convictions, a lifetime of regret. For anyone who has ever felt discarded, falsely accused, or questioned by those who were supposed to protect them, Clara's story is a testament to the fact that starting over isn't a punishment. It's a privilege. It is the privilege of writing your own ending without the dead weight of someone else's insecurities. True empowerment comes